Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Ghost in the Ranks. The air in the Great Hall of the Imperial Military Academy didn't smell like victory, it smelled like an expensive, suffocating locker room. Thousands of high-ranking alphas stood in rigid formation, their scents clashing in a silent, violent war for dominance. There was the sharp sting of ozone, the heavy musk of leather, and the cloying sweetness of fermented honey. And then, there was the Beta block. Luke Baltimore stood at the dead center of the third row, his spine a perfect vertical line. To the sensors, and the noses, of the faculty, he was a vacuum. He had spent years mastering the neutral hum, a meditative suppression technique that flattened his alpha signature into a scentless void. To the world, he was just another sturdy, dependable, and ultimately forgettable beta. "Look at them," a voice hissed from Luke's left. It was Marvin, a genuine beta whose scent was a faint, harmless whiff of dry paper. "The alphas are already trying to piss on the floor to mark their territory. Especially that one." Luke didn't turn his head, but his eyes tracked a tall cadet walking down the center aisle. Levi Oakland. Levi's presence hit the room like a double shot of burnt espresso, dark, bitter, and aggressive. He intentionally brushed his shoulder against the cadets in the beta line, leaving a scent mark of dominance on their uniforms like a physical stain. When he reached Luke, he stopped. Levi leaned in, his nostrils flaring as he tried to catch a whiff of fear. He found nothing. No sweat, no sour notes of anxiety, just the sterile smell of laundry detergent. "You're a glitch in the system, aren't you, Baltimore?" Levi sneered, his voice dropping to a low, alpha-weighted growl designed to make a beta's knees buckle. "You're so plain you're practically invisible. Don't get in my way during the live-fire drills. I'd hate to mistake a ghost for a target." Luke didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "I'll try to stay within your line of sight, Cadet Oakland. I know how easily you get distracted by your own reflection." Marvin let out a choked sound that was half gasp, half laugh. Levi's scent spiked, the espresso turning scorched and acrid, before he moved on, his jaw tight. The afternoon transition to the firing range, the first official test of genetic aptitude. The alphas took the primary positions, their movements loud and boastful. They used their pheromones like physical weight, trying to throw off the aim of those around them. "Positions," the sergeant barked. At the far end of the balcony, Arvin Peterson leaned against the railing. Unlike the other alphas, his scent was grounded, the steady, comforting aroma of wood smoke and pine needles. He watched the chaos below with a bored expression until his eyes landed on the scentless beta. Luke picked up his standard-issue pulse rifle. He felt the phantom itch of his own power, a massive, roaring alpha core that wanted to tear through his skin and flatten every ego in the room. He pushed it down. He didn't need his scent to win, he needed his eyes. Bang! 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 The electronic scoreboard flickered. Levi Oakland. Alpha 96/100. Angelo Vane. Alpha 92/100. Luke Baltimore. Beta 100/100. The range went silent. Levi whirled around, his face reddening. The sensors are calibrated for alpha reaction speeds. There's no way a beta clocked a perfect score on a reflex drag sequence. "Maybe you're just loud, Oakland," Luke said, calmly setting his rifle back on the rack. "Hard to aim when you're busy smelling yourself." Up on the balcony, Arvin Peterson straightened up, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He watched Luke walk away, a man who left no trail, no scent, and no survivors. "A wolf in sheep's clothing," Arvin whispered, the scent of pine wood sharpening with genuine interest. "Or something much, much worse." Chapter 2, Wood Smoke and Pine. The tactical simulation grounds were a sprawling maze of concrete ruins and synthetic fog, designed to mimic the urban decay of a frontier war zone. For most cadets, it was a playground of ego. For Luke, it was a high-wire act. "Squad 7, front and center," the drill instructor barked. Luke stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel with a rhythmic, unassuming thud. He felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of alpha pheromones before he even saw the squad leader. It was Arvin Peterson. Arvin didn't peacock like Levi. His scent, wood smoke and pine, didn't attack the senses, it anchored them. It was the smell of a forest after a fire, steady and dangerously calm. As Luke took his place in the line, Marvin and Angelo were already posturing. "I'll take point," Angelo announced, his alpha scent, something metallic and sharp like ozone, flaring to assert dominance. "A beta like Baltimore should stay in the rear. Don't want him getting overwhelmed by the weight of the combat zone." Arvin's gaze shifted. He didn't look at Angelo. He looked at Luke. "Baltimore is the only one in this squad who isn't bleeding scent like a leaky radiator," Arvin said, his voice smooth but edged with authority. "In a real stealth op, Angelo, you'd be a flare in the dark. Baltimore, you're on my wing. We move in 30 seconds. The simulation, Sector 4. The fog in the simulation was thick, laced with electronic interference to scramble sensors. Most alphas relied on their sixth sense, the ability to track the pheromonal spikes of an enemy's fear or aggression. Luke, however, relied on the void. As they moved through a collapsed storefront, Arvin signaled for a halt. He was close, too close. Luke could feel the heat radiating from Arvin's tactical vest. The scent of pine was intoxicating, a grounded contrast to the static hum of the academy. "You're too quiet, Baltimore," Arvin whispered, his breath ghosting over Luke's ear. "Even betas have a pulse. You're like a ghost. It's unnerving." "I'm just focused, sir," Luke replied, his voice a flat, neutral line. Internally, his alpha core thrashed. Being near an alpha as powerful as Arvin was like standing next to a sun. Every instinct in Luke's body wanted to roar back, to prove he was the bigger predator. Suddenly, a flashbang detonated. "Ambush!" Marvin yelled. A squad of upperclassmen descended from the rafters. In the chaos, Arvin was shoved back against a pillar by two attackers. Luke moved without thinking. He didn't use a weapon, he used leverage and terrifying, silent speed. He intercepted an attacker mid-air, slamming him into the concrete with a force that shouldn't have been possible for a beta. In the struggle, Arvin grabbed Luke's arm to steady himself. The contact was electric. For a split second, Luke's control slipped. A microscopic fracture appeared in his scentless mask. It wasn't a smell, it was a pressure. A sudden, localized gravity that made the air in Arvin's lungs vanish. Arvin froze. His pupils dilated, his own alpha instinct screaming danger. Superior. Run. Then, just as quickly, the pressure vanished. Luke stepped back, his face once again a mask of beta indifference. "Are you all right, Captain?" Luke asked, offering a hand. Arvin stared at the hand, then up at Luke's eyes. The wood smoke scent around him spiked, turning rich and scorched. He didn't take the hand. He stood up on his own, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it never had for a mere beta. "I'm fine," Arvin said, though his voice was strained. He looked at Luke as if seeing him for the first time, not as a ghost, but as a predator hiding in plain sight. "Let's finish the objective." As they moved out, Luke felt Arvin's gaze burning into the back of his neck. The mask was holding, but the cracks were beginning to show. Chapter 3, The Espresso Sabotage. The high-stakes atmosphere of the Imperial Academy was a breeding ground for obsession, and Levi Oakland was currently drowning in it. To Levi, the world was a ladder made of scent and pedigree. Luke Baltimore, a flat, odorless nothing, sitting at the top of the tactical rankings was a glitch that needed to be purged. "He's hiding something," Levi hissed, cornering Marvin in the communal showers after a grueling endurance drill. The air was thick with Levi's bitter espresso scent, amplified by his frustration until it smelled like burnt beans and charcoal. Marvin, clutching his towel, looked pale. "He's just disciplined, Levi. Some betas are just built different." "No beta is built to outrun an alpha in a full-kit sprint," Levi growled, slamming a hand against the locker next to Marvin's head. He pointed to the small, metallic case protruding from Luke's open locker. "He takes those supplements every morning. Beta enhancers. Illegal stimulants to bridge the genetic gap. I'm going to prove he's a fraud." When the locker room cleared, Levi swiped the injector case. He didn't just want to report Luke, he wanted to watch him crumble during the Night Ops Ghost trial, an exercise where cadets had to navigate a pitch-black forest filled with infrared sensors and pheromone-sensitive traps. The Night Ops trial, 2,200 hours. Luke felt the shift the moment he stepped into the humid night air. Without his morning dosage of the synthetic stabilizer, his internal alpha core began to hum. It wasn't a scent, not yet, but a physical vibration in his marrow. He reached into his pocket for his emergency vial. Empty. He looked toward the tree lean, where Levi stood with a smug, caffeine-laced smirk. He took them, Luke realized. A cold, predatory calm washed over him. Levi thought that by stealing the stabilizers, he would force Luke to crash or reveal a hidden beta drug addiction. He didn't realize he had just removed the leash from a monster. "Squads, deploy," the instructor signaled. As Luke surged into the woods, the lack of stabilizer caused a terrifying phenomenon. Instead of leaking scent, Luke's body became a thermal and pheromonal sink. He wasn't projecting power, he was absorbing the environment. The forest's natural scents, damp earth, rotting leaves, the sweat of other cadets, were being pulled into the void he created. He became a black hole in the sensory field. "Where is he?" Angelo muttered, glancing at his tactical HUD. "Baltimore's vitals are on the map, but the proximity sensors aren't picking up a single biological signature. It's like he's not even breathing." Levi's squad moved through the underbrush, their heavy alpha scents marking them like neon signs in the dark. Levi was confident. He had the high ground. He had the beta's medicine. Then, the woods went silent. One by one, Levi's teammates were neutralized. No sounds of a struggle, no scent of an attacker. Just the soft thud of bodies hitting the moss. "Show yourself, Baltimore." Levi roared, his espresso scent spiking into a jagged, acidic mess. He swung his training rifle wildly, the infrared scope showing nothing but cold trees. Suddenly, the air around Levi turned frigid. The scentless hum Luke usually maintained had collapsed into a vacuum. Levi felt a hand wrap around his throat from behind. There was no smell of sweat, no heat of a body, only a crushing, absolute presence. "You stole my stabilizers, Levi," a voice whispered into his ear. It was Luke, but the tone was different. It carried the weight of a mountain. "You wanted to see what I was hiding. Look closely." Levi gasped, his eyes bulging. In the absolute darkness, Luke's eyes seemed to catch the faint moonlight, glowing with a primal, alpha intensity that shouldn't exist in a beta. For a heartbeat, Levi didn't smell espresso or pine, he smelled nothingness, an abyss that threatened to swallow his very soul. Luke didn't strike. He simply squeezed until Levi's vision blurred, then vanished into the trees just as the recovery teams arrived. When Arvin Peterson reached the scene minutes later, he found Levi shaking on the ground, clutching the stolen injector case. Arvin picked up the empty vial, his nostrils flaring. The air around the spot where Luke had stood was unnaturally clean, scrubbed of all life. Arvin looked into the dark woods, the wood smoke and pine of his own scent flickering with a mixture of fear and a deep, soul-stirring recognition. "You aren't a beta," Arvin whispered to the wind. "And you're definitely not a fraud." Chapter 4, Cracks in the Mask. The atmosphere within the Imperial Academy's Auditorium Sigma was thick enough to choke a civilian. It was the annual Heat and Rut seminar, a mandatory lockdown event where the air filtration systems were intentionally dialed down to substandard levels. The goal was for the cadets to learn to maintain tactical discipline while surrounded by the raw, aggressive pheromones of their peers. For Luke, it was a waking nightmare. Without his stabilizers, which Levi had lost during the night ops, Luke's internal engine was redlining. He sat in the back row, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. But inside, his alpha core was a caged beast, pacing behind his ribs. The room was a cacophony of scents. The alphas were posturing, their musk turning sharp and metallic as they tried to out-dominate one another in the enclosed space. Marvin, sitting 2 seats down, was already sweating, his pale beta scent turning sour with the alpha pressure in the room. "You okay, Baltimore?" Marvin whispered, wiping his forehead. "The air is like lead in here. I feel like I'm being stepped on by a giant." "I'm fine," Luke lied. His voice was a flat, synthesized calm, but he could feel the void, the vacuum he had created during the night ops, starting to pull at the edges of his skin. He wasn't just scentless, he was becoming a black hole, drawing the ambient pheromones of the room into himself to keep them from igniting his own. Halfway through the lecture on chemical tactical advantage, the dean called for a 10-minute break. The alphas surged toward the water stations like a pack of wolves. Luke, feeling the pressure in his skull reach a breaking point, slipped out a side door into the darkened locker rooms. He needed cold water. He needed to breathe. He had barely splashed his face when the heavy thud of the pressurized door echoed through the tiles. The scent hit him before the sound of footsteps, wood smoke and pine. "You're not fine, Luke." Arvin Peterson stood by the row of lockers, his tactical jacket discarded. In the dim light, the alpha's presence was overwhelming. Usually, Arvin kept his scent restrained, but here, in the heat of the seminar, he was radiating a warmth that felt like a forest fire. "Captain," Luke said, not turning around. Water dripped from his chin into the sink. "You shouldn't be here. The seminar rules state." "Forget the rules," Arvin snapped, stepping closer. The distance between them vanished until Luke could feel the heat coming off Arvin's chest. "I saw you in the auditorium. You weren't breathing. Every beta in that room was struggling, but you were something else. You were consuming the air." Arvin reached out, his hand hovering near Luke's neck. "Levi's in the infirmary, raving about a void that tried to kill him. He says you're a monster, Luke. He says you have no scent because you're a hollow shell." Luke finally turned, his eyes locking onto Arvin's. The scentless hum was vibrating now, a low-frequency roar that only an alpha of Arvin's caliber could perceive. "And what do you think, Captain?" Arvin's hand closed around the back of Luke's neck. It wasn't an attack, it was a claim. His thumb brushed against the scent gland at the base of Luke's jaw, the spot that should have been pulsing with a beta's mild, floral musk. It was silent. Completely, eerily silent. "I think," Arvin whispered, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated in Luke's very bones, "that I've spent my whole life hating the noise of alphas. The screaming, the boasting, the stench of ego. I thought I liked betas because they were quiet." He leaned in, his nose pressing against the crook of Luke's neck. He inhaled deeply, searching for a sign of a lie. "But you're not quiet, are you?" Arvin's grip tightened, his own scent of pine turning dark and resinous. "You're the loudest thing in this academy. You're a goddamn hurricane, and you've just bottled it up so tight that it's turned into a vacuum." Luke's control snapped. He didn't release a scent. He released the pressure. The air in the locker room suddenly felt like it had been sucked out by a jet engine. Arvin gasped, his knees buckling as Luke's null zone expanded. It was a raw, primal alpha command that didn't need a smell to communicate its message: "I am here. I am more." Luke caught Arvin by the shoulders, pinning him against the lockers. For the first time, the mask was gone. Luke's eyes were dark, predatory, and unmistakably dominant. You wanted to know what I am? Luke's voice was a low growl. I'm the weapon this empire built and then forgot to label. And if you breathe a word of this to the Dean, Arvin, I won't just mute your scent. I'll stop your heart. Arvin looked up at him, breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't look afraid. He looked captivated. I don't want to tell the Dean, Arvin rasped, a slow, dazed smile spreading across his face as he leaned his forehead against Luke's. I want to see you tear this place down. Chapter 5, The Underbelly of the Empire. The underground levels of the Imperial Academy didn't smell like the sterile, lemon-scented hallways above. Down here, past the restricted biometric gates, the air tasted of ozone, cold steel, and the metallic tang of dried blood. 10 minutes, Arvin whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilation shafts. He stood by the service elevator, his wood smoke and pine scent flared just enough to mask the sounds of Luke's movement. To any guard passing by, Arvin was simply a high-ranking alpha performing a late-night security sweep. The patrol cycles every 600 seconds. If you aren't out by then, I can't keep the sensors jammed. Luke nodded, his dark tactical gear making him a literal shadow in the dim corridor. I don't need 10 minutes. I just need a port. Since the locker room confrontation, the dynamic between them had shifted into something taut and electric. Arvin wasn't just a captain anymore, he was an accomplice. He watched Luke move with a predatory grace that no beta could mimic. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of fabric, only the terrifying efficiency of a ghost. Luke slipped into Lab 4C, inside, rows of glowing green stasis pods lined the walls. Each contained a failure, recruits who hadn't survived the Academy's secret Alpha Optimization program. He moved to the central terminal, his fingers dancing across the holographic interface. He wasn't just looking for names, he was looking for the Project Chimera files. He needed the proof that the Academy was forcibly suppressing the Scentless gene in children to maintain a hierarchy built on pheromonal manipulation. Access denied. Damn it, Luke hissed. His internal alpha core pulsed. Without his stabilizers, his frustration acted like a localized EMP. The screen flickered, the scentless vacuum he projected accidentally pulling at the terminal's power grid. Access granted. He began the data transfer, the progress bar crawling at agonizing speeds. Outside, the elevator chimed. Arvin stiffened. The scent hit him first, burnt espresso and acidic sweat. Levi Oakland. The coward had recovered from the night ops, and his scent was now laced with a frantic, paranoid edge. He was followed by Marvin and Angelo, whom he had bullied into joining his investigation. Peterson? Levi stopped, his eyes narrowing. What are you doing down here in the restricted wing at 0200? Security audit, Oakland, Arvin said, his voice dropping into a heavy, alpha command. He stepped into Levi's personal space, his pine scent expanding like a territorial wall. Which you are currently obstructing. Return to your barracks. I smell something, Levi countered, his nostrils flaring. He tried to push past Arvin toward Lab 4C, or rather, I smell nothing. That void, it's here. Baltimore is here, isn't he? Inside the lab, Luke saw the progress bar, 88%. He could hear the confrontation outside. If Levi forced his way in, the mission was dead. Luke closed his eyes and did something he had never dared. Instead of suppressing his alpha core, he inverted it. He didn't push his power out. He pulled the entire room's atmosphere in. The door to Lab 4C hissed open. Levi burst in, followed by a wary Marvin and Angelo. I knew it. Levi shouted, raising his hand to point at the terminal. But the words died in his throat. The lab was a sensory graveyard. The hum of the pods, the smell of the chemicals, even the heat of the electronics, it had all been swallowed. Luke stood by the terminal, his back to them. When he turned, he wasn't the scentless beta anymore. He was a pillar of absolute, terrifying silence. "You're looking for a scent, Levi?" Luke asked. His voice didn't travel through the air, it seemed to vibrate directly in their skulls. Luke took a single step forward. The null zone hit Levi like a physical weight. The espresso scent vanished, snuffed out like a candle in a vacuum. Levi's knees hit the floor. He tried to growl, to assert his alpha status, but there was no air for his pheromones to catch. He felt like he was drowning in clear water. "There is no beta here," Luke whispered, leaning over the paralyzed Levi. "And if you ever follow me again, I won't just take your scent. I'll take your breath." Marvin and Angelo stood frozen, their eyes wide. They didn't feel the malice directed at Levi, but they felt the gravity of Luke's presence. It was a power so refined, so absolute, that it transcended the petty brawling of scented alphas. The terminal beeped. "Transfer complete." "Arvin," Luke called out, his voice returning to a normal, quiet tone as he re-established his mask. "Clean this up." Arvin stepped into the room, looking at the three cadets trembling on the floor. He looked at Luke, and for a second, the wood smoke in the air turned sweet, a scent of profound, dangerous pride. "With pleasure," Arvin said. Chapter 6, The Beta Revolution. The fallout from the laboratory heist was swifter than anticipated. By morning, the air in the academy didn't just feel heavy, it felt electrified. Luke sat in the center of a windowless interrogation room, the stark white LED lights reflecting off the metal table. Across from him sat the dean, a man whose scent was like old parchment and cold ash, and a team of medical evaluators. "Your biometric data from the night ops is anomalous, Cadet Baltimore," the dean said, tapping a stylus against a tablet. "A beta who produces a sensory vacuum during high-stress combat. Some would call it a miracle. The board calls it a reclassification opportunity." Luke kept his hands flat on the table. He could feel the null zone itching at the tips of his fingers. "I'm a beta, sir. My records are clear." "Records can be edited," the dean countered, his cold ash scent sharpening. "We believe you are a rogue alpha variant. One that belongs in a lab, not a barracks. You are being transferred to the High Security Research Wing for optimization, effective immediately." The door slid open, and two guards moved to seize Luke's arms. But before they could touch him, the room filled with the sudden, grounding roar of wood smoke and pine. Arvin Peterson stepped into the room, his stride carrying the weight of a century of military lineage. He wasn't wearing his tactical gear, he was in his full ceremonial blues, the gold braid on his shoulders catching the light. "Step away from the cadet," Arvin commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of the Peterson name, the family that funded 40% of the academy's budget. The dean bristled. "Captain Peterson, this is a faculty matter. Baltimore is being reclassified for the safety of the student body." "Baltimore is a member of my tactical squad," Arvin said, stepping between Luke and the guards. He placed a hand on the back of Luke's chair, his scent wrapping around Luke like a protective barrier. It was the first time Arvin had used his alpha status so blatantly, and the smell of pine was so thick it nearly smothered the dean's ash. "If you move him to a research wing without a formal hearing before the High Council, I will pull my family's endowment before the sun sets." The dean's face turned a mottled purple. "You would compromise the academy's research for a freak?" "I'm protecting an asset," Arvin lied smoothly, though his fingers brushed against Luke's shoulder with a lingering warmth that was anything but professional. "One that you clearly don't understand." Hours later, Arvin dragged Luke into his private quarters, a privilege of his rank. He slammed the door and locked it, the wood smoke scent in the room turning frantic. "They know, Luke," Arvin hissed, turning to face him. "They don't know what you are exactly, but they know you're the key to their Chimera project. My family, they've been part of this for generations. They've been looking for a scentless alpha to use as the ultimate assassin." Luke walked to the window, looking out over the academy grounds. He could see Levi Oakland across the quad, surrounded by a group of fearful-looking betas. "I know. I found the files in the lab. Your father's signature is on the 2022 authorization forms." The silence that followed was suffocating. Arvin's scent dropped to a low, mournful ember. "Luke, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Luke said, turning around. He walked toward Arvin, his own scentless aura expanding until it met Arvin's pine scent. Usually, two alphas this close would be a recipe for a territorial bloodbath. Instead, the scent seemed to braid together, the wood smoke filling the void Luke created. "They're going to try to take me during the grand maneuver," Luke continued, his voice steady. "They'll use the chaos of the live fire sim to make me disappear into a lab." Arvin reached out, grabbing Luke's tactical vest. "Then we don't give them a chance. If they want a monster, let's give them one. My family thinks they own the hierarchy. Let's show them what happens when the hierarchy stops smelling like them." Luke looked at Arvin, the alpha who should have been his natural rival, but had instead become his anchor. "If we do this, Arvin, you lose everything. Your name, your rank, your future." Arvin leaned in, his nose brushing against Luke's temple. The scent of pine was fierce and resolute. "I'd rather be a ghost by your side than a king in this cage. Tell me what we need to do." Luke finally let a small, dangerous smile slip. "We need to make sure everyone hears the silence." Chapter 7, The Final Simulation. The Grand Maneuver was the Academy's crown jewel, a live-fire urban simulation staged in a 3-square-mile artificial city. To the public, it was a showcase of imperial might. To the dean, it was the perfect place for a kidnapping. The air was thick with a synthetic, pre-storm humidity. Luke stood at the edge of the city center zone, his pulse rifle slung low. Beside him, Marvin and Angelo were checking their mags, their movements jittery. "Something's wrong," Marvin whispered, his beta instincts firing. "The air, it's changing." He was right. From the opposing side of the plaza, a wave of scent rolled in that was nothing short of chemical warfare. Levi Oakland emerged from the fog, leading a specialized strike team. Levi's usual espresso scent had been artificially amplified by the dean's experimental serum. It was now a jagged, oily stench that smelled like burning rubber and caustic chemicals. It was so potent that the weaker betas on the field began to gag, their eyes watering. "Baltimore." Levi's voice boomed through the speakers, distorted and manic. "The dean gave me a gift. A scent so heavy it'll crush the lungs of any ghost trying to hide in the dark." Arvin moved to Luke's side, his wood smoke and pine scent acting as a localized filter, but even he was struggling. The sheer volume of Levi's amplified pheromones was designed to paralyze. "Luke," Arvin rasped, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I can't hold the line. He's saturating the entire sector." Luke looked at the observation balcony high above, where the dean sat behind reinforced glass, waiting to see his scentless alpha break under the pressure. "Arvin," Luke said, his voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. "Close your eyes." "What?" "Close them. And stop trying to smell the air." Luke stepped forward. He reached deep into the center of his being, to that roaring, lightless core he had spent a lifetime chilling into a neutral hum. He didn't just stop suppressing it, he threw the doors wide open. He didn't release a scent. He released a void. It started as a ripple. The oily, burning stench of Levi's espresso hit an invisible wall and simply vanished. Then, the sound began to die. The hum of the drones, the shouting of the cadets, even the wind seemed to get sucked into a localized vacuum around Luke. "Where is it?" Levi screamed, stumbling back. He looked at his wrist-mounted sensors. "The pheromone levels, they're dropping to 0. I can't smell anything. I can't even smell my own hands." This was the null zone. Luke walked through the plaza, a silent reaper. Every alpha he passed fell to their knees, not because of a scent, but because of the sudden, terrifying absence of one. To an alpha, who lived and breathed through sensory dominance, the null zone was like being cast into deep space without a suit. It was a sensory deprivation so absolute it felt like death. Luke reached Levi. The enhanced alpha was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He tried to raise his rifle, but his muscles refused to fire in the vacuum. Luke leaned down, his face a mask of cold, celestial beauty. You relied so much on the noise of your status, Levi. You forgot how to be a soldier without it. With a single, fluid strike, Luke disarmed him and pinned him to the concrete. He didn't use pheromones to command him, he used the sheer, terrifying weight of his existence. High in the observation booth, the dean slammed his fist against the glass. What is happening? Why aren't the sensors picking up his signature? Because there's nothing to pick up, sir, an aide whispered, trembling. He's deleted the sector. Arvin stood in the center of the null zone, the only one who wasn't collapsing. Because he had surrendered to Luke's presence long ago, he found a strange, peaceful clarity in the silence. He watched as Luke looked up at the dean, then slowly raised his rifle, not toward Levi, but toward the Academy's central transmitter. Luke pulled the trigger. The spire exploded in a shower of sparks, and the ghost trial went dark. The simulation was over, but the silence was just beginning. In that moment, the entire Academy knew, the hierarchy hadn't just been challenged. It had been erased. Chapter 8, The Scent of Change. The smoke from the destroyed transmitter spiraled into the artificial sky, a dark signal fire for a revolution that hadn't yet been named. In the silence of the null zone, the Academy felt less like a fortress and more like a tomb. Luke stood over the crumpled form of Levi Oakland. The enhanced alpha was awake but broken, his eyes darting frantically. To Levi, the world had become a terrifyingly quiet place, his power stripped away by a man he had called a ghost. Luke didn't spare him a second glance, he turned his back on the status quo and walked toward Arvin. Arvin met him halfway. The wood smoke and pine scent was returning to him now that the vacuum had stabilized, but it felt different, softer, more intimate. The data is out, Arvin said, holding up a tactical tablet. The moment the transmitter blew, the fail-safe I installed triggered. The Chimera files, the genetic tampering, the Dean's private ledgers, they're hitting every major news network in the Empire right now. There's no taking it back. Above them, the glass of the observation booth shattered. It wasn't an explosion, but a choice. The Dean stood at the jagged edge, looking down at the ruin of his legacy. Military police, genuine Imperial soldiers, not Academy goons, were already swarming the upper decks. You've destroyed a century of order, the Dean bellowed, his voice cracking. The Alpha hierarchy is what keeps this empire stable. Without it, we are nothing but animals. Luke looked up, his voice carrying through the quiet plaza with chilling clarity. If your stability requires the systematic torture of children and the suppression of the truth, then it deserves to burn. We aren't animals, Dean. We're just finally breathing air that isn't yours. As the MPs led the Dean away in shackles, the other cadets began to stir. Marvin and Angelo approached tentatively. They looked at Luke with a mixture of awe and a new, grounded respect. They didn't bow, the null zone had taught them that bowing was for the weak. They simply nodded, soldiers recognizing a leader who didn't need to roar to be heard. A week later, the Academy was under a provisional government. The Scentless were no longer classified as glitches, they were being recognized as a legitimate genetic evolution, the sentinels of a new era. Luke stood on the roof of the barracks, the same place he had spent so many nights suppressing his soul to a neutral hum. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of the coming winter. So, what's next? Arvin joined him at the railing. He had traded his ceremonial blues for a simple black flight suit. He had been stripped of his family's inheritance, but he had never looked more alive. The military is being restructured, Luke said, looking out at the city lights. They want me to lead a new division. One based on merit, not pheromonal pressure. They're calling it the Ghost Wing.